I'm going to start by getting you to just to think about that notion of leadership in schools. And so a typical way to look at it is something like this. And so there will be a principal leadership, and we have a lot of research about that. You know, that's where the dominant amount of research is for very good reasons. In most contexts, that principal will be the person with the most responsibility, most opportunity, most obligation to be exercising something that we'd want to call leadership. Then there'll often be, depending on the school, size of the school, where it is, senior leadership. And then there's going to be a middle level of leadership, and then teacher leadership sitting somewhere there. Jana's concept of teacher leadership as that notion of influence outside of the classroom gets you into the middle leadership, perhaps, gets you up to senior leadership level, perhaps, but it's a different idea. And then you might even want to start thinking about student leadership. There's a lot of literature on that. And we've even got literature coming through about parent and community leadership in the school context. Outside of that, of course, there are things, there are layers around us, schools often if they're in a system. And so you'll talk about system leadership. In the North American context, you might be talking about superintendents. In other contexts, you'll have different labels for that. You might even want to put governance there. Now, governance is a separate area of study, which is a bit odd, but you could even be talking about governance. And then, of course, we've got other ideas which envelop these sorts of things. So notions of distributing leadership, whether it's distributed, shared, collective, learning communities, professional learning communities, all those sort of things. So there's a lot of ways to think about leadership in schools. And we are really focused on those two in bold. You have to contextualize your work. Okay, so teacher leadership and even middle leadership and those other ideas doesn't always work in all contexts. So here's my context in Australia and in Victoria. So I'm in the state of Victoria, and down the bottom is how the Victorian government system describes people in schools. So they talk about self-leadership when you're beginning as a teacher, emergent leadership as you get a bit more experience, and then going into team leadership where you're leading groups of people, and then into school leadership, system leadership. Okay, there's no talking about teacher or middle leadership in that, but you can overlay the teacher and middle leadership ideas. When you get to New South Wales, which is in the light blue, they have this notion of teachers first, then teacher leaders, then middle leaders, and they've got labels for those, assistant principals and head teachers. And then they talk about senior leaders as being deputy principals, and then the system folk. AITSL, which is the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership, which is a federal government body and has influence across Australia, they have this lovely graduation. Classroom teacher who then becomes a teacher with leadership responsibilities. So still a teacher, but with some leadership responsibilities. Then they become a leader with some teaching responsibilities. And so the amount of teaching is shifted, and then they become a leader only. So as you progress in career, in terms of AITSL, that notion of how much teaching you're doing and how much leadership work you're doing is the thing that's changing over time. And in terms of teacher leaders, you can either have the narrow grey bar or you can have the big extended grey bar. So a lot of teacher leadership work is more at that early stage of career before they pick up a leadership role. But some ideas about teacher leadership extend right across and beyond the school. So Jana is one where you're talking about influence. It's an influence model, and talking about influence outside of the classroom. That can actually be quite extensive, because you could, for example, be picking up a role in a subject association outside of your school where you're influencing widely across your jurisdiction. But these are the frameworks that work for me. You have to think about the frameworks that work for you in your context, because our ideas of teacher leadership, right, will not work across the world, and you have to keep that in mind. We know the definitions of teacher leadership, and so I'm not going to put that, but Jana's one is actually, one, and I wasn't familiar with it And so it was absolute pleasure hearing about it. And to my mind, it's actually got more clarity than most of these in terms of thinking about teacher leadership, for me, anyhow. A lot of these definitions for me are not specific enough. They have a vagueness to them. But these are your standard ones. These are the four big reviews over the last 20 years that a lot of people refer to, and even the more recent reviews will refer back to these people, particularly York, Bark, and Duke. We know that that's been so influential, and it's a great paper. No doubt about it. I'm also interested in the notion of middle leadership, and so I come to Atlas from a middle leadership perspective. Okay, and so that's a slightly different perspective. And middle leaders are these people that are teachers but have a formal leadership responsibility, typically either in a curriculum area or a pastoral area. So ahead of a learning area, ahead of a discipline, or in charge of a group of students. Okay. But they can also be teacher leaders in some of those definitions of teacher leaders. So there's a lot of overlap in the knowledge base, and I'm going to talk to you about both of that. So if I think about teacher and middle level leadership, these are the distinctions. And again, teacher leadership is largely this thing about influence more than position, where middle leadership will often involve a position in addition to being substantially a teacher. Okay, the senior leadership stuff, you are less a teacher. In fact, you might have no teaching responsibilities, and your work is more leadership oriented. And of course, an early career teacher will be more intensely focused just on their teaching. We can make claims about the work of these folk. And so, again, because the literature between middle leaders and teacher leaders overlaps so much, I'm going to put it together and say we can make claims in these 5 areas quite well. They're trustworthy. They're good claims. Again, you have to contextualize it for your jurisdiction, because again, these things will not necessarily make sense in all jurisdictions across the world. So we know that both middle leaders and teacher leaders can impact positively on students and on schools. Okay? And in fact, the school effectiveness and improvement people, and the ICSE conferences in Melbourne in February would argue that without activating these people, without supporting these people, you won't get as much impact. The way they do it is through this notion of collective endeavour, so getting people to work together to improve teaching and learning, getting the conditions right, getting people oriented and improving. And that can be either through the influence process that we heard about with teacher leaders just before, and you had some examples of that. You were talking about examples of this, or it could be informal roles. That notion of development and improvement in curriculum and pedagogy is important. Also complexity, though, because they can also have all these other roles and more. Right? Social justice orientation, change champion, critical friend, advocacy. There's a lot of that work that comes. In a lot of the work that I do, we talk about looking at your role and seeing. So we talk about the role that you applied for, the expectations that go with a role, and then what you bring to a role. And often with the interventions, people will bring these other orientations, so a strong social justice feel to their work. There has to be a leadership focus to the work. Right? It can't just be managerial or administrative. There's got to be more than that. Managerial and administrative, absolutely important, right? Our organisations don't run without that work, absolutely important. But there's got to be a bit more than that. And there has to be high expectations of the teacher and middle leaders themselves and from the senior leadership. And role clarity, if you've got a role, there has to be role clarity. Okay. We need to make sure that we're supporting people to do this work. And so we need to be able to identify and support people and help them in careers and help them as they transition into formal leadership roles, going from a teacher leader into a middle leader, into a senior leadership role, and so forth. And then that gets us to the last one, which is support. And I'll just show, in terms of how we support these folk, these are the sorts of things we can do. The people need to be proactive in their own professional development. We also need the senior leadership to support them. We need leadership development programs to support that work. We need a supportive culture and structure. So I used to teach a class each year for a system, and we'd have 75 to 100 people come in each year, and they're all called literacy leaders. We go around the room and we say, well, what do you do? What do you do in your work? Some people say, I'm full-time literacy leader. I do nothing else. All right. And that'd be someone in a large primary school, elementary school. And then I go to someone who's in a secondary school, a high school, and they say I get one period a week. And they're not sure what to do with me because the English folk don't like me and are not sure what literacy is. And they're all called literacy leaders within a system. They've all got a label, but they're all very different. So that supportive culture and structure, if you want someone to do a job, how are you supporting them? That notion of role and having management and leadership expectations within that role. Again, the teacher leadership is often not a role as such. It's attribution that we put onto someone about the work that they do. In terms of where the research comes from, there's no surprise that the USA dominates. Okay, it just does. There's an overwhelming amount of work coming from the US. Let me just show you this slide. And Peter put this up earlier, and this is from a review he's done with Wendy Pan and colleague. And you can see, in terms of teacher leadership literature, North America is United States. Let's say, well, I'll exclude Canada. Canada's good, but the United States is overwhelming. All right, the teacher leadership literature largely comes from the United States. Quite a range of other countries, and with significant contributions from Canada and Hong Kong and the United Kingdom and Australia and South Africa. But and let me just show you middle leadership. There's a lot of the world that's not covered. This is middle leadership. So I'm just, I've got a map for that. There's a lot of the world that's not covered when we talk about this stuff. So that's important to understand. Just in terms of, are we interested in this? Absolutely we are. So traditionally we talk about the three big areas of transformational, instructional, and distributed. Right? But Alma Harris and Michelle Jones back in 2017 said the fourth area is teacher leadership. And if you add middle leadership to it, it's certainly the fourth area. So there are four areas that we really do work in, and that's still instructional is a dominant area. Horrible term, instruction. Who does instruction? But anyhow, leadership learning or something like that is better. But that notion, transformational, so a motivational theory of leadership is important. And then distributed leadership. So how do we distribute leadership within our organizations? And then teacher and middle level leadership. Okay, they're the ones. Middle leadership has that same dramatic increase after about 212. Both teacher leadership and middle leadership accelerates away. Someone said to me, because I was actually teaching a class on this last night, it's my morning at the moment. They said to me, is this because there's something going on in schools? And I said, no, it's not. It's actually to do with the fact that we've got a lot of universities around the world that are really becoming very powerful universities. And you know, if you see the rankings, you'll know that there's the rise of the Asian universities. There's going to be a collection of Indian universities coming through, and Africa and all those other countries that haven't been represented are suddenly coming through. And so you've got a lot of scholars, academics coming through, and everyone wants to publish. And so a lot of this is to do with the nature of the expansion of the academy as well. And that's just, as I said, the map of the middle leadership folk. And this is on some of the teacher leadership work and the type of a scholarship that there is. And you'll see this overwhelming. It's a qualitative approach. not much in the quantitative. There are some instruments. Pam Angeal has a lovely teacher leadership instrument. We heard about Jana's instrument as well. So there are things around, but a lot of the work is still to do with interviews and observation. Right? And that's not a criticism, it's just really a statement. It makes sense. So the quantitative work will get you those big, broad characteristics, but we want to know the detail, and so we need a lot of that qualitative work. No surprises there, I don't think. Okay, and this is just an example from another article by Alma Harris and colleagues. They reviewed 49 papers on middle leadership, and 43 were qualitative or mixed methods. So overwhelming, that's where we're going. And that's really just a statement of that. So again, in terms of Bill's going to be talking about research directions and other things. And so that gives you a pattern. And that's all I'm going to end at that point. I have some little models that we might refer to later on if we need them. But if we don't need them, I won't refer to them.
All right. So we're going to talk about the future of teacher leadership. Let me get this thing up and running. There we go. All right. So I'm just going to ask you, and you can respond in the chat. But what do you believe the future of teacher leadership research is? What direction does it need to go in? Monument Valley. Okay. What does anyone have an idea in the chat where teacher leadership is headed? The research? Okay. Well, I'll just content-focused teacher leaders. All right. Activism and social justice. That is actually one that I came up with. More research on equity. Teacher retention. To what extent should teacher leadership be limited to a certain number of individual teachers in schools? All right. Teacher behavior and influence. More collaboration. All right. Area policy. Early teacher leader. Okay. Here's kind of what I came up with. When I perused the current research areas, this is what I came. Wrong one, dummy. Wait a minute. Okay, we just did that. By the way, y'all know the difference between a leader and a boss, right? The leader's out in front, pulling with you, and the boss is standing behind, just telling you what to do. All right. So when I perused the research journals for trends in teacher leadership and scholarship, these are the things I found. I found these 9 areas that are currently trending in teacher leadership. The highlighted yellow ones are the ones that I actually work in. And that green one I thought was very interesting because it's a, what did they call it? Let me find it here. Teacher leadership. Okay. That's an emerging trend. It's something that's relatively new, where teachers are taking active roles in shaping educational policy. When I teach my class on educational policy at the doctoral level, I have a picture that my former superintendent, and he actually was the deputy superintendent for the state of Alabama. It's a picture of a person pointing to a chalkboard saying, "This is a list of all the people who are experienced in education that are making our policy." And can anyone tell me what's on the picture? Nothing. Because all our policy is being dictated, at least in the United States, is being dictated by politicians and special interest groups. And so this new emerging teacher leadership and policy advocacy is a new trend that is developing. But what I found in the United States, really the bulk of our research builds off of Jenna's research, where what exactly is a teacher leader, and then the distributed leadership models in the sharing of responsibility for improving teaching and learning. In the state of Alabama, I can tell you, because that's where I do most of my research, Our principals are non-tenured. They have no job protection. And so they tend to be very weary of relinquishing any control over what goes on in the school because they're the only ones that get fired if the school doesn't do well. So these are the areas that are emerging. The technology and teacher leadership, and that has really boomed since the COVID when schools went to um, distance learning. And in fact, at the University of Alabama, my particular program is 100% online. All my certification programs, the masters and the two EDSs that we teach are 100% online. So these are the emerging trends in educational leadership, in teacher leadership. Okay, I got one more slide because we've talked about definitions of teacher leadership. So I just published an article that had this definition. Our working definition of teacher leader is someone who provides guidance, advice, and mentoring to teachers within the school and outside their classrooms. And to me, the key was to improve teaching and learning, because what else is teacher leadership all about? And so that's the focus of a lot of research, is that we've got to have teacher leaders to improve teaching and learning. And I think it was David that said early on that quality teacher leadership is imperative to have effective schools. That's all I have.